When COVID first started, there was a certain amusement that there were so many people holding on to conspiracy theories, mistrusting the governments as if the governments were trying to take away their freedom and they had to fight the governments. It's a year and a half now, and we still have protests with people saying, COVID is not real. The scientists are lying to us. The experts can't be trusted. Governments are trying to take away our freedom of life. What? What quality of belief? What is your quality of belief? But what quality of belief is it? What sort of belief is it that says, I know better than the experts, I know better than the general population, I know better? What goes into that kind of thinking? Well, let me offer this suggestion, that's what I've been doing in these talks. I've been saying that we know better, we can think better when we engage critical thinking. So the quality of belief, my claim is high. It's a high quality of belief. Critical thinking rests on the assumption that not all beliefs are equal, that some beliefs match reality more than others, and that to be healthy, to be happy, we want to engage in those healthier beliefs that are closer to reality. That doesn't mean I can tell you political views, I can't tell you religious views. I'm just saying that at a very common sense, humans in reality kind of way, these are some of the ways of doing critical thinking, regardless of politics and religion. But what we see in so many of these protests are politics overriding common sense, maybe religion too, but also appeals to popularity, whereas this group believes it, therefore I believe this group because I'm a part of the group and not because the group necessarily has a strong argument. Okay. So today I want to talk about how we apply critical thinking, quality of beliefs, to the pandemic in terms of healthcare, ethics, and law. Healthcare, ethics, and law. Think of this as sort of a summary also of the things that I've been talking about, or we've been talking about for the last little while, in terms of thinking better, and thinking more clearly. Healthcare decisions reflect, like all of our decisions, reflect our belief systems. I use the phrase quality of belief, but it's really what is your belief and how closely related is your belief to reality. The hope is most of us will be able to engage fully with the world around us in a healthy way. But there are many things that are getting in the way of that. Critical thinking is said to be a universal way for helping people see, know, interact with the world. To the degree that it's possible, it's not perfect. It's not perfect, and that's why phrases like inductive reasoning come into play and inference to the best explanation. I'll discuss those again today. But you and I are faced in this generation with misinformation and conspiracy theories at a volume that has never been shared. It's never been this prevalent before. There have always been lies and propaganda and people that want to use us and people who want to control us. Okay, we know that. And not even us, just historically speaking. But because of social media and the internet, we are just awash. There's a flood of misinformation to the point that when we get up in the morning, we don't even know where to start. Who can we trust? Which experts are actually experts? The loudest voices, we've come to realize, are often not the most informed, and their belief systems often not the most credible. So if it's not the loudest voices, then which voices ought we to listen to? Well, first we arrive, or we hopefully can accept, that there is misinformation out there, that it's not all equally true. And from there we begin to sort, to weigh, to judge. When COVID first started, it was a bit amusing, sort of, to hear all of the dissenting voices dissent so quickly and without evidence that this was a hoax. After the first year, when things started to open up again, I remember I was standing outside at a hardware store because you weren't allowed to be inside, and you could stand outside 6 feet apart from other people. And I remember standing in line. I'm wearing a mask like everybody else, except for the gentleman in front of me who wasn't wearing a mask. And I heard him just strike up a conversation with the person in front of him regarding how COVID was a hoax. Okay, well, he's still standing in line. And then he actually pulled out a mask when he went into the store. So he was following the rules or the law so that he could access the store. But his belief system was in conflict with the larger popular consensus. And his belief system said that people are lying to us, that it's not real. And my instinct was to think, well, how? How could he possibly know that? Had he done surveys? Was he going to hospital to hospital? Does he have some sort of information that the rest of us don't have? Well, as we know, since that time, that's become a bit of a popular mantra amongst a certain select group of people. But does their belief system match reality? Certainly, you would think that they believe that. They believe that. But how do they know? This is, I know it's a philosophical question, but how do they know what they claim to know? Let me refer you to some of the previous conversations regarding fallacies of reasoning. I will argue today that the protesters, COVID deniers, they're committing a lot of fallacies of thought, of reasoning, that make their thinking dangerous. It's not just that we're all entitled to our own beliefs, because we are. We all have our own beliefs. And it's not just, and I certainly don't want to censor people. Everybody should be talking about their views. But just because you have a belief system doesn't mean it has equal weight. And I, for one, am so tired of seeing the protest signs with gibberish on them, emotional slogans, appeals to popularity, appeals to tradition. Hey, what worked in the past works today. These sorts of things that are hurting people. We have tangible, concrete evidence. These sorts of ways of thinking, especially in a time of global pandemic, hurt people. So how do we move past that through critical thinking? We can't force people to think a certain way. My suggestion is we just accept that there are some helpful skills, helpful tools for processing the world under this banner called critical thinking, and that they can help us out a lot. So here are some of them in terms of healthcare, ethics, and law. In terms of healthcare, we need to look for causes. What is the cause of this? In the case of COVID, we need to look at why is this person getting sick? Why does this person need a respirator? And then why is this person dying? And we need to track that back, in this case, to a virus. And we need to look at many, many, many people who have something similar to this, to trace that back to where it came from, to trace it back to its origin, to figure out, okay, that these people are all suffering from the same thing, more or less. Then we can try and find out what that thing is, specifically the virus. I'm not qualified to do that, but there are people who can use computer modeling and algorithms, the basic causal scientific stuff that we've discussed before in terms of theory development, creating models again, but then predictions, then getting data, doing experiments to see if those predictions are accurate, then looking at conflicting theories, just that basic cause and effect kind of stuff. That's what we do. Now, we do that not just with COVID. We do it in terms of what foods will keep us healthiest. We do that in terms of when I have a cold, so not something terrible, but a cold, is there something I can take to help with a sore throat? These are just basic cause and effect things. Not just with healthcare, of course, but mechanical engineering and all these different things. But what seems obvious about cause and effect, you look for reasons for why, seems to be lost on many people. They're convinced in the overhyped politicalization of COVID. They can't be a cause. They're convinced it's not real. And it's I don't know what the right word is. It's heartbreaking to hear, to watch these, to read these tweets from doctors, actual doctors tweeting on their own account about how patients come in. They're so convinced there's no such thing as COVID. They're dying because of it, and the doctor's telling them this is why, and they still say, no, you're wrong, because there's no such thing as COVID. Their belief system is so entrenched, so dogmatic, so fixed, that even when the medical expert is telling them, you have these symptoms, you're dying of this, I'm so sorry, it's too late for a vaccine, they still say that person's wrong. It's heartbreaking. And how we get to that situation in life where our views are so closed and rigid, I don't know. I've had rigid views. I'm sure I still do. I'm just not aware of them. Hopefully I will become aware of them. But that kind of thinking hurts people, gets people sick, and it kills them in an age of COVID. But causal reasoning, thinking about basic cause and effect through this larger term, inductive logic or inductive reasoning, is just one means for us to begin to pry open our assumptions and our views and our biases to let, hopefully, the truth of what's making us healthy and what's making us sick come to light. But we have to get past our closed-minded dogmatism. We have to get past everything's politics, so whatever you're saying is false. I can't trust experts because they're all lying to me, and I can't trust government. We have to get past that through a focus on cause and effect relationships. Some of the problems with cause and effect, thinking about it just in general, there are many problems with it. First, it's very complicated. Cause and effect is, I mean, again, that's why it's so hard to find cures for things like cancer, or to figure out that smoking causes cancer, or to find a cure for COVID, because life is so complicated that it's beyond what most of us can deal with. We need communities of scientists. No one of us can understand, really, this huge body of literature. We need entire groups of people working on this problem, which makes some of us feel a bit powerless, right? That I don't have direct access to the truth of the world. But we don't. We don't have direct access. These things are so complicated. We can have indirect access. Usually there's a translation involved. So maybe it's global warming. I'm interested in global warming, so I want to understand it. I'm not in a position to just go to the researchers directly and read their research. I really wouldn't understand it, probably. I can try. Usually I'll need an intermediary. So maybe it's the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I'll read that literature because it's kind of digested a little bit, and then okay, I understand it. So I didn't have direct access to the truth. I went to an intermediary who helped explain what the scientists were saying, and the scientists who are doing a bunch of experiments on nature. But I'm still getting something better than I don't have COVID even though I'm dying of COVID because I know it's a hoax. Right? It's so much better. Summer of 2021, I was watching news footage of a group of protesters in Calgary, Alberta, and the protesters had shut down traffic. And they had all kinds of signs, the typical signs, fighting for freedom, and the lockdown is wrong, and mask mandates are wrong, and these things it's not true. So what were they saying? Well, basically the protesters were saying they have knowledge, they have truth that the majority of Canadians misunderstand. The majority of Canadians don't have, but the protesters do. So in a way, they're fighting for our freedom and fighting for their own freedom because they want the truth to be revealed. Interesting, because that's something that happens with rational human beings. We give claims and we make statements that we then support for truth. The difference, however, is that with the protesters, the claims are very rarely supported with anything that even remotely looks like a scientific study or evidentiary report, or even common sense, really, for that matter. Often, and I'm generalizing, so it's not always the case, and there are many protests on many topics that are fully legitimate, but in the case of COVID, the repeating pattern that I see is that the protest is based in an appeal to popularity. That is, I have a group of people, they all agree with me, and because they agree that COVID is a hoax, therefore it's a hoax. And that's a fallacy. So scientists are doing something similar. Scientists are saying, we believe there's such a thing as COVID, and as a group we believe, so they're appeal to popularity. But then they offer evidence for it, and they can show tracing, they can show the testing that shows where the virus came from, and that it yields very specific symptoms in people, and that it changes their blood chemistry. So they can show that. By contrast, the protesters are just saying, we think this. And then they stop. There may be arguments of a political nature saying that you can't trust governments because of this, or governments are hypocritical, and it may be very true. But when it comes to the cause and effect, the inference to the best explanation is a fancier term we used before, they come up short, radically short. Just that observation alone could save human lives. That unless they have an actual inference, the best explanation, with some kind of evidence to support it, we have good grounds for dismissing them. And they have good grounds for dismissing their own belief system. But again, very hard for us, all of us, and I'm not just pointing fingers at people, but all of us to really critically evaluate our own belief system. It's very difficult. This same kind of protesting crowd, different people obviously, made their way to Ontario, and maybe they're living in Ontario, and in front of hospitals. On one occasion, at least one occasion, a doctor was so upset with these people protesting in front of a hospital. The doctor went out and said, you people have to stop. Right? He went on the news and he explained, you are getting in the way of people's health care. They're afraid to cross the line. They're being intimidated. There are people who are so sick, wheelchairs. They're not coming here because you're standing out with your proclamation, with your declaration that this is the truth. We should never censor people. People should always be allowed to say what they think. We need to have conversations about these things. But the conversations need to be based in something substantial, more than just I believe because I believe, more than just I believe because these people believe. We need plausible arguments for why. We need to understand causal relationships, cause and effect. We need to work on our inference to the best explanation. We need to do more to save lives. Yes, I'm basically arguing that critical thinking can save lives. On the topic of misinformation, it is so, on the one hand, we've become so used to it. On the other hand, we've become so annoyed by it. Everywhere we turn, mistruths, half-truths, Facebook saying it's going to work to stop the lies, and Twitter canceling major political players from having accounts because of the lies. And it just goes on and on and on. Who do we know to trust? Well, I think we can all agree at this point that the news media are far from ideal. And the news media are far from ideal in a number of respects. First, they're motivated by profit. They have to make money to survive. They have to pay their employees. They have to pay for their web servers. They have to, you get the idea. So they have to make a profit. How much of a profit? That's not clear, given that the major players that own these stations are making billions of dollars. So, okay, maybe there's greed involved. But also they have structural limits. People are not going to watch the news for 6 hours a day to get a thorough story. Most stories get conveyed in less than a minute. Right? So, and they're usually conveyed by people who are non-experts. Just Joe Schmo, right? We're just Jill or Joe. We're just going to tell you this story. We're going to use an authoritative voice when we talk about it. But really, we have no expertise, no background, no education in the field, but we're covering this important story. Part of that, we just have to, right? You can't hire professional doctors to do every news broadcast. You couldn't afford it. Also, again, the structural issue. What we have now are a number of problems in terms of the media conveying the world as it is. Human bias, human interest, conflicts of interest. We can all agree to that. And I mean, it is what it is. Okay, that's the world we live in. But what do? We need to go beyond the headlines. We need to go where the experts are. We need to figure out, again, we may not be able to understand the experts directly, but we need to get an intermediary to help us understand not just what the flippancy of reporting conveys, even the deepest of investigative journalism doesn't reflect years and years that scholars have invested in certain areas. So we need to somehow connect with those. We had a whole conversation about expertise. How do you know if someone's an expert? How do you know if someone's credible? And it's not hard to know if someone's an expert. Tucker Carlson, not an expert. Was it Jim Costa on CNN? I forget his name. He's not an expert. These are, not to sound patronizing, they're talking heads that take information, they try and make things sound controversial so they'll get the views. They're not experts. Therefore, in many ways, we need to turn the news off. In many ways. It's often more harmful than not. That sounds negative. But the positive side of this is that the news doesn't have to be our only source. The news that's been largely bought by corporations doesn't have to be our source of truth about the world. There are other places, but many of us don't have the energy, the time, or we just don't want to invest the effort in going to scholars. There's stuffy scholars in the ivory tower. We don't want to read actual books. We don't want to look at articles. It's just too much effort. We'd rather grab a sign, spray paint it, that COVID is a hoax and go out on the street because it makes us feel good. I feel like I'm being pedantic here, but it makes us feel good to be a part of a crowd. My self-esteem goes up when I'm with other people of like mind that agree with me. But that doesn't mean my belief system is correct. It doesn't mean it's wrong either. It doesn't mean it's directly wrong, but it doesn't mean it's correct. I need to understand professionalism and expertise, and I need to tap into that as best that I can, knowing that it won't be perfect, but it's light years better than the spray-painted sign. And some spray-painted signs are pretty cool, don't get me wrong, but most of them are just appeals to emotion. It's psychologically persuasive, but it's the fallacy of an appeal to emotion. Not helpful when you're talking about healthcare and life and death situations. Last example on healthcare decisions and cause and effect reasoning. When COVID first started, even among my family, I was told, make sure you have lots of vitamin C on hand. There's a global pandemic killing people, and I'm getting advice from family members, make sure you have vitamin C on hand. Why? Because the belief has been that vitamin C has helped with colds and flus. This is an appeal to tradition. I'm appealing to tradition, what's happened in the past, therefore it's going to help now. It doesn't mean it's wrong. Doing an appeal to tradition doesn't mean it's wrong, but there was no evidence to substantiate that vitamin C had any impact on COVID at all. In fact, there's very little, as I understand it, zinc is the only thing that may have some kind of, I'm not a medical practitioner, don't listen to me, or an expert in medicine, but zinc may be closer to doing something. Calcium, vitamin C, nothing, or next to nothing. It may help, with other bone density or something like that, but it doesn't work. It doesn't do anything, and it's so easy to see cause and effect. You simply give it to people. Do they get better? No. Replicate the study. Do a larger group. Look at the population. Look at the target group. Stuff we've talked about before. It's so simple to figure out, and yet, on at least one occasion, I remember seeing a gentleman wearing a white lab coat, like just such the cliche. So presenting himself as if he was a doctor on YouTube, and he wasn't. I think he was a nutritionist or something. So he didn't have a medical degree, and he was so authoritative that in his statement that vitamin C will save people from COVID, without even flinching, he's saying this. So here we have a global pandemic. People are dying. And we have people, for financial reason, or maybe he really truly believed it, or maybe he wanted to kill people, I don't know, saying vitamin C without any real support behind it. This leads into the other part of this talk, which is the ethics of healthcare, the ethics of law, but just ethics in general, and how there's a connection between critical thinking and being responsible thinkers, like just common sense responsible. We don't have to have PhDs in electrical engineering to talk about electrical engineering, but just responsible thinkers and people who have a wanton disregard for basic cause and effect, basic inference to the best explanation, that hurt people, that really hurt people. You can probably tell by the tone of my voice, I'm so frustrated by this because I see it almost every day in the news. I just read a story before doing this lecture, and I shouldn't have read the story about a couple that were absolutely insistent they didn't have COVID. And we're getting tweets, first-hand tweets from doctors themselves and Facebook posts from the doctor, the action, not second-hand, not third-hand, but the doctors treating these people. And so husband and wife, it's a hoax, and the husband's in the hospital, he's really sick, and like close to dying. And he just, no, it's not COVID. She dies, the wife dies. The husband's convinced it's not real the whole time. And you hear this, and it breaks your heart. It's heartbreaking, that kind of closed dogmatism in which no amount of critical thinking about cause and effect or inference to the best explanation can change their mind. And it should. It should. We, as a culture now, can be better. We can be healthier. We can be happier with this kind of thinking. Again, I keep giving the caveat. It's not perfect. The inference, this is all inductive logic. It's not perfect, but it's just so much better than blind belief. The next is law, critical thinking and the law. So again, in the age of COVID, it's been a year and a half now, and in the earlier parts of the pandemic, around March in Ontario, the government had an emergency declaration. So they used the law to shut down businesses and get people to stay home. And you weren't allowed to travel. You were not allowed to travel. So the reach of the government is very powerful. And understandably, whenever somebody tells you to do something, people get a little anxious, right? The government's telling me what to do. I'm afraid to leave my house because the police might pull me over. My wife and I, what is it we want to do? We wanted to go, I don't know where we wanted to go, but we can't go because even though we're not going to see people, wherever it was we wanted to go, we weren't going to see anybody. There was no way, but we were afraid because we weren't even sure if the law was in effect yet, or if it was. Yeah, it was a couple days away. That's what it was. The law was coming into effect in a couple days. And what happens if we go where we needed to be, and we got stuck there and we couldn't get out? Anyway, it's terrifying and it's scary. For the first time in our lives, we were thinking about how the government might not be our friend because there's so much control over how we did our daily lives. And there's a general feeling in your day-to-day life, the government's not totally in control, but for the first time, we're feeling, the government's really in control. So it's a natural feel. And so there were a number of protests, people taking their masks off, protesting the government, how dare you, how dare you, how dare you. And the argument is simple. Why the law? Why the law to stay home, to wear a mask? Why the law shut down businesses? Because it was based on cause and effect reasoning, an inference to the best explanation brought about by experts in the field. Not perfect, but they're experts in the field. Common sense, there's a virus going around the world, so we need these laws to keep people home. And they worked. And they worked. Well, if you believe the stats were accurate, you could see the virus go down, the spread go down when people followed the law to stay home. But this too is a very specific form of thinking. In law, if you're a lawyer, so your defense or your prosecution, your lawyer, the prosecution is saying this person is guilty and they try and prove their case. The defense is saying this person is innocent and they try and prove their case. So in law, you have this critical reasoning, this adjudication, this weighing of information, of evidence, of argument. Part of that manifested in a conversation between healthcare and government. We saw this in Alberta again, where doctors got together, signed a huge, apparently unanimously, never unanimous, I'm sure quite close, doctors saying that if the government didn't act now to bring more laws in and shut things down, that the virus is going to spread exponentially, that people are going to die. So here are doctors now saying the government's not listening. They're not using the law like they should. Doctors are saying, you got to stop. And what happened? Well, lo and behold, the numbers went way up. Critical. And why? Because the law wasn't used appropriately based on cause and effect, based on inference to the best explanation, medical science. And based on our previous conversations, there are a lot of ways, the discussion of law, the application of law, what's good or bad behavior, a lot of ways in which the thinking about that can go wrong. Begging of the question in which the answer is already implied, or the answer is already assumed in the argument for an answer, the false dilemma, where a person is either right or they're wrong, or maybe they're a little bit of both, we could make that. Ad hominem is a huge one in arguments regarding the law, where, and we saw this with our political leaders, where people would freak out. Freak out's not a very nice way of phrasing it. They would be very upset that the government is saying stay home and wear a mask, and instead of attacking the credibility of why they should stay home and why they should wear a mask, people would say, oh, that Justin Trudeau, and that, oh, Premier Ford, and they would attack the people who represent the governments that are enforcing these laws. That's the ad hominem. Super popular and super ridiculous. There's no point in attacking Justin Trudeau's hairstyle. If you don't like the policy regarding having to stay home, well then you fight against that argument. Why it's baseless, why it's meritless. Attacking the politicians only creates greater hostility and greater anger. Something that we're all too good at, it seems, as a culture. Always so quick to be hostile when confronted with an alternative point of view. And again, it's not just alternative points of view, it's alternative points of view with substance. Another popular one is the appeal to emotion. I've discussed this already with the protests. I really understand, I empathize with the fear and the anxiety that we don't really understand how the virus works, that we don't understand what's going on. But almost immediately in March, a year and a half ago from when this video is being done, a little more, people were saying it's not real. And they had no way to know if it was or it wasn't. They're just their knee-jerk reaction. If the government says it, if experts are saying it, it has to be wrong. Why? Because that's how I feel. That's an appeal to emotion. I feel that it's wrong. I feel that lockdowns are bad. I feel that masks kill me when I wear them. That is a very, very limited form of support. It is a form of support, having an emotional reaction and feeling. That's legitimate. That's genuine. But so often it's wrong. So often. And I have to be honest too. My emotions are often inaccurate and don't represent necessarily the best course of action that I should take. There is a part of this conversation, or part of this reasoning, that falls into the subjective fallacy or subjectivist fallacy, which is that your views are your views and it's all just a matter of personal opinion. I don't know who really believes that. I don't know if the people who are against, they don't think COVID's real. I don't know if they believe that or not, but there's certainly a hint of it or a tinge of it. You're telling me this is a bad virus, but I don't see anybody actually suffering from it. Therefore, I'm inclined to just assert my own views or my own judgment. And hey, why not? Your judgment and my judgment are equal. Well, that flies in the face of the assumption that I said we're already making. And that assumption is that some beliefs have more merit than others because they connect with reality more than others. So that subjectivist belief, not very helpful in this context. So the final connection I want to make is between critical thinking and ethics. And we're going to tie together healthcare, the law, and ethics. These all sort of go together. What is ethics? Ethics is the study of right and wrong, or the action of right and wrong, or the belief system about what's right and wrong. Ethics is a huge field. So there are three big theories. The first one is called teleology. Teleology, fancy word for purpose. What is the purpose-driven life? What is your purpose as a human being? Everything in nature has a purpose. Trees do what trees do, from dropping acorns, growing in sand or the soil, and you get the idea. Everything has a purpose. What is human purpose? So the ethical theory here says that to be the best version of you, to be good, to act well, is to realize human purpose. All right. The next one is deontology. I've discussed all these before, but just a quick review. Deontology, the study of duty, that we have obligations to other people. Maybe it's an obligation to God. Maybe it's simply an obligation to reason, to be rational. And certainly what I've been driving home with these talks, we have an obligation to reason, but it's a duty. And the other one is consequentialism, or utilitarianism, which says that a good person looks at the results, the consequences. So the ends justify the means. I want these results. The purpose-driven life is about not just the results, but throughout your whole life, are you realizing purpose? Deontology is, throughout your whole life, are you following reason? Are you achieving reason? Consequentialism is, what's the result? Typically, that's, do I get the most happiness for the most number of people? That's what I want. These can overlap in different ways, but they're all doing this. What does it mean to live a good life? Well, and this is a little confusing, but if my argument is correct, that arguments themselves are good, that thinking about our belief systems, weighing our belief systems are good. It has value to think critically. It has life-affirming value. It increases our health. It increases civic life, peace. It increases conversation, increases knowledge. Then it's also the ethical thing to do. If critical thinking yields a closer or greater understanding of the world, and this is positive overall, then we're ethically obligated to think critically, to think scientifically. That's just a start, to think about cause and effect, to think about inference to the best explanation. And when we don't, when we insist that our belief structures are correct, to the point that we will hold up a sign in front of a hospital telling the doctors that they're lying to us and they're wrong, that's unethical. There's something wrong there. Our thinking is faulty, but also our ethics is faulty. We're not good people when we stop sick patients from getting into a hospital because we're so consumed with our own belief system that is beyond question, a belief system that is beyond rebuke. Hey, I'll be the first one to admit, I've had wrong beliefs. I have held on to wrong beliefs for years, and it took a long time, and I'm sure I have many more, but it took a long time to begin to challenge them and to see through them. And I needed help. I needed help from other people. I needed expertise, right? I needed advice from people in fields germane to that topic. So I'm the first one to admit we all make mistakes, but there's this fervor, this persistent hostility against thinking critically, evident with many of these protesters, that I will say is unethical. Because it's not just unhealthy for them, it's unhealthy for other people. To refuse to think, you don't have to think my way, just the common sense way of cause and effect, inference to the best explanation, this inductive reasoning overall. So of the three theories, teleology, deontology, and consequentialism, all of them seem to suffer. All of them break down when we don't think well. In terms of teleology, just very quickly, if you're a human being and you're not flourishing in terms of thinking well, you're not realizing your purpose. Part of being human is to think, to be thoughtful. The consequentialism, you're probably not going to be happier overall, right, by not thinking about how to achieve positive ends. And of course, deontology, where you're responsible to reasoning. If you're not reasoning at all, then you're basically being disrespectful to yourself. All of these things then combine what we see in the age of COVID in terms of healthcare and the need for critical thinking, in terms of the law and the need for critical thinking, and also in terms of ethics. Am I a good person in the age of COVID? Well, I hope we're all becoming better people. I believe we're trying, but some people are falling short and really hurting others in the process.